Working at projects is really important, and that's part of a landscape approach. And if we do it the wrong way, we'll upset what's happening in Tanzania and other projects. We've got to integrate those together. But working at a landscape scale allows you to link projects together to start to solve larger ecological problems. We built a corridor for recreating elephant migration in DRC. It allows you to get accurate baselines, to share your resources for monitoring. It allows you to do all of the stakeholder mapping together and engagement. You don't have to each do it alone. And what we really found in these projects that surprised us was that you start getting different sorts of people talking to each other, and suddenly they see synergies and they start to want to work together. The conservationists and the loggers had been fighting for decades in DRC, 1 million hectares of concessions. When there was carbon money available, suddenly the logging companies started to acknowledge that some of those concessions weren't viable. They were happy to let them go, get a carbon payment, and have them turned into conservation areas. The conservationists were delighted. The conservationists were working with the communities for reforestation. Suddenly, the communities needed some technical forestry help to do that reforestation, to create plantations for charcoal production, to take the pressure off the forest and sell charcoal to Kinshasa. So the energy industry got involved as well. All of these synergies started to build, and I think that's what we're seeing. We found that with landscape programs, which are in the reefs of Fiji. We found it more recently. We've been pulled into discussions with the world of peatlands in Ireland and Scotland, but the same principles apply.
No, thanks, Paul. Really useful. I think we've covered this a little bit, but maybe drilling down to the regional level might help sort of elaborate this question. But what would you say is the current sort of state of play when it comes to jurisdictional approaches, on the ground right now, just to help the audience sort of understand what's going on when we say jurisdictional, what's actually happening around the world?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, sorry, that was a question to any one of you or all of you, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that, again, there's been a lot of excitement and momentum on the demand side. And I think on the supply side, there's a number of governments that are really trying to figure out what to do. Like the demand side has said to them, if you create these emission reductions, we'll buy them. And on the supply side, the governments have said, well, yeah, how do we do that? So there's a tremendous amount, and this is really talking about pure jurisdictional level program. There's a tremendous amount of work that's needed to do to build the capacity and provide the technical assistance that's necessary for the government to get to the point where they can kind of, repackage what work they've already done to meet, third-party market standards in the voluntary carbon market. And so, I think it's worth mentioning, especially for this crowd and this conference, is, what role the private sector has to play in that. I think there is an opportunity, again, I mentioned it this morning, of bringing in some blended financing because it is a heavy lift for the private sector to come in and be able to do all of that work on capacity building and technical assistance. And, the World Bank has already done a lot of that work. But so if we think about this, and I think this kind of pulls together some of the comments that you both were making, is that this is not just a real top-down approach, right? If we think about kind of where things are going, some governments are going towards a pure jurisdictional, which is JNR scenario 3, right? It's the pure jurisdictional where all the credits and emission reductions are generated at that government level, and then they allocate the benefits to these projects. But if we think about governments, they can set those policies and those regulations, but actually to create those emission reductions, that is bottom-up activities. That's the kind of, hard work that you guys are doing in the field, and actually implementing those project activities from, on the ground. So at the same time, the governments need to be able to finance these programs, right? They know that. They know that there is financing from the private sector that's needed, and they need to get that financing up front. That's desperately needed in this market right now. Sure, there's all this downstream demand, and that's great, but who's actually paying for these programs and paying for the activities that actually reduce emissions? So that's where this nested approach is so important and comes in, because if you do this nested approach, which means that the project sits within the jurisdictional program as a standalone project, it uses an allocated baseline, but it is allowed under the government program to actually generate and sell emission reductions into the international market. And, everything just adds up, right? Like, there isn't a inflation of that particular project against the jurisdictional baseline. Everything, all the accounting adds up. Then if you have that kind of true nested system, that's where you can get the project level finance, right, coming in from the private sector, and you can get this other type of finance coming in at the landscape level, because that's not necessarily carbon generating. That's like biodiversity, that's, watershed protection, that's all of these other environmental benefits that don't necessarily generate carbon. And so that's why this kind of top-down, bottom-up approach is so important. But going back to your question, where are we? There's no governments that have sort of gotten there yet or figured this out. So this is where we're going, and hopefully we can encourage that, and as a private sector, and as we try to help these governments develop these programs, we want to make sure that they're putting in place regulation that allows for nesting within these jurisdictional programs, so they can get the private financing they need to do the activities they need to generate emission reductions.
Thanks for that, Sherry. I'm really glad you brought in the private sector element. That was in my notes to tee up if it didn't come up naturally, but of course it did, and really important to speak to in this room, and also to elaborate a bit more like what the various jurisdictional approaches, as we're sort of calling it in this panel, can look like, because it's not just one sort of uniform approach. There's all these different scenarios that countries might take and that projects might take. Over to you, Joe. Do you have any comments maybe on what Sherry said about the current state of play? Does that sort of ring true to what you're seeing in Tanzania, or just sort of elaborating on that point?
Sure. It does obviously resonate strongly. And I think the bigger point is a jurisdictional approach in one country might look quite different to in another country. In Tanzania, our experience and our experience on the ground tells us that it would be incredibly hard for Tanzania to take the approach that, for example, Guyana has just taken. Guyana is, 85% forested, 90%? The government essentially owns the entire, block of that forest. There are some indigenous groups there, of course, that need to be taken care of in a sense, and hopefully that's being, taken care of in that deal. But the fact is the government can basically say that's our forest, and we will credit it under a jurisdictional program, and that's it. There you go, buy the credits. That could never happen in Tanzania, and it almost certainly couldn't happen in many of the bigger, mosaically forested countries across Central and Southern Africa. It's very hard for the government to take such a centralized approach. However, they could set a very clear framework within which people could work, using, as we've talked about, jurisdictional baselines, jurisdictional risk maps, and the whole thing. So there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't apply a jurisdictional approach. You just have to make sure that you're not telling governments that there's one way to do it. And it has to be like this or it has to be like that. We don't want people turning around and telling, the world that, well, everyone has to do what Guyana's done, or everybody has to do what Ghana's done. It has to be quite nuanced. I understand that for the market, that's not always very helpful. It makes it quite confusing, perhaps, for people out there. But our job, as Sherry's saying, is to say we will do what we can to put in place projects at the greatest possible scale that takes care of landscape effects, that generates high quality, high integrity credits that are accounted for as well as possible. And we will do it according to, hopefully, well-developed, well-thought-out government structures when and if and when they are put in place. And that's the commitment we can make to the market. And those credits that come out of those programs will, as time goes forward, hopefully, take on the characters that are, you know, transparent and recognizable by the market out there and become investable, you know, products, let's call them. And I think that's that's the kind of vision, the would like to see scenario, I think, for a lot of us in the business.
Great, thanks, Joe. And then, yeah, to you, Paul, is that sort of bringing your perspective from what's happening on the ground in the UK and your projects? Yeah, just curious to hear the, sort of current state of play, I suppose.
Yeah, it's been very instructive to get involved in this world of peatland carbon, which is a totally different world and a separate invention, and knew nothing about forest carbon, certainly not jurisdictional carbon. So we've been able to bring a lot of the lessons from the red world across. But also you see some of the mistakes that were made in the world of forest carbon. The early red work was purpose designed to keep the corporate sector out. It was very hard for corporates to get involved and for corporate investment to take place. We did see some fantastic, there's been some fantastic work, Anne Green, for instance, the Tropical Landscape Finance Facility in Jambi was Michelin Tire Company getting involved in creating a landscape solution to their rubber plantations, deforestation in their rubber plantations. And I think we need to be able to find a model to do that rapidly. What we're finding in Scotland, for instance, is that there's a peatland code. It gives certainty on how to work in producing peatland restoration and peatland emission reductions and getting credits and selling those. Where that's heading, though, and the Government of Ireland has asked us to help them across the whole country develop a jurisdictional scale peatland restoration program. So how to go from projects that are a few hundred hectares, thousands of hectares in some cases, to be able to restore 750,000 hectares of degraded peatland. That's what they have. Now, peatland is way better at storing carbon than forests, 20 times more effective on average than forests. So it's a no-brainer to work in peatlands, but no one's been thinking about it at jurisdictional scale. We're now starting to build a standard for Ireland. We're looking at whether we can add a biodiversity component into that as well as carbon. And the water industry is very interested. They want to look at whether they can create water credits or some sort of water payments, because peatlands are a fantastic water tank in the top of the hills above towns and prevent flooding and so on. So if we can work out this equation and we've got some real projects on the ground already, and we know that there's 100 more of those projects in each sector, then we can build something that can really scale quite rapidly. Again, a reason for doing the jurisdictional approach is that what we're realizing when you start thinking across a system like that is the biggest problem is going to be diggers, bulldozers, and operators, trained operators. And so we can start designing in funding for training courses for operators, supporting businesses that can go out and buy 100 diggers, and so on. And so this creates business opportunities. Peatland research and monitoring systems could be an export industry for Ireland and Scotland. So it just changes the game a little bit, and if it works well, it should really help the project develop, because it'll take a whole set of burdens off their plate.
Thanks, Paul. No, bringing in the sort of beyond carbon elements is useful.
Beyond forest and agriculture, sorry.
Exactly. So we have just over 10 minutes left, so we should probably turn to the floor, to the audience for questions. So maybe we should do that now, and then we can always come back to the panel with some final remarks. Questions in the room?
Thanks very much, Darius Sasha from SLM Partners. Yeah, it was about maybe 10, 15 years ago that I first started or worked in RADD projects in Indonesia, so I've got a long-standing interest in this. But so my question is really, I was shocked by how the promoters of sovereign red are really trying to hammer voluntary projects, almost, and I would have thought a much more nuanced approach where you could have nested projects within a sovereign red or jurisdictional red scheme backed by government would be a key mechanism. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to know if one of the other panel comment on why they think the sovereign red team are really hammering voluntary projects. And two, also, just to Joe, I was with you for a long time when you were describing the difference between Tanzania and Guyana, but I still think actually that the Tanzanian government could say the entire country's forest cover is under a jurisdictional approach, and we're going to put in place some incentives and promotion to increase afforestation and woodlot planting and integrating trees on farms and smallholders. So it could even Tanzania could fall under a sovereign red. I wonder if you've got any comments on that. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone want to take?
I mean,
sure.
Do you want me to, that's easy to answer.
Okay, go
Then
for it.
you can have
Yeah,
the hard one.
sure. Yeah, sure.
No, just quickly. I mean, fair enough. I think I was thinking a bit too much about forest protection. We do have such a devolved forest management governance framework in place in Tanzania. It's highly devolved down to village level. So when I said that, Darius, I was really reflecting that land tenure and management rights situation that we have. So when I said the government would not be able to do it from a centralized point of view, that's what I meant. I don't think you're wrong in saying that there's also other ways to incentivize carbon emission reduction projects to go ahead in the ARR sector or the smallholder farmer agroforestry, let's call it, sector. I think that's probably true, and I think what you're getting at there is that we do it in agriculture, we do it in agricultural commodity chain, so why couldn't we do it in smallholder farmer kind of situations? I think that could be something that could be looked at. And to be fair, because we're so focused on avoiding deforestation and natural habitat protection, I wouldn't be able to comment on how practical or not that is. So I'll accept it is a very distinct possibility for Tanzania. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. And then Sherry for the hard one.
It is a really complicated question. So, the way that and it gets I don't want to answer like what I think that they think or that they're why they're hammering so hard. I think that they do see the world as kind of black and white, and there is a bit of a disconnect in the way that we see the world, right? I actually think that we can coexist in that those transactions that they're pushing at a sovereign red credits, red dot plus that standard. They could exist under Article 5, right? These are emission reductions that are created using national FRELs, which are negotiated politically. That is a political decision as to what your FREL says. And in the case of Guyana, when we talked about Guyana a little bit before, is Guyana's FREL, this is not under art trees, but previously, and I know this because I wrote the jurisdictional program for Guyana. So Guyana's FREL was not an indication of historic deforestation. It was a combination of international rate of deforestation and their own historic deforestation. And that exists a bit in the HFLD standard under art trees. So that probably some of that kind of flowed over. But their FREL was essentially done in a way that they could really do nothing and still be paid $250 million by Norway, which they were. And so that's not really an offset, right? It's not additional, and it's not it shouldn't be treated under Article 6.4. It's something else. It's a results-based payment, And I think that that's the position of IETA, if I'm,
Yes,
I
yeah,
don't want to
thank-
speak for you.
No,
but
no, thanks,
I think that
Sherry.
might be
Yeah.
the position of IETA as well.
Yeah.
It just doesn't have the same level of rigor and monitoring that is required to create a voluntary carbon market compliant credit. And so I do see a world where both of these things can exist, but I don't think that Red Dot Plus exists under Article 6.
Yeah, no, I think well said, Sherry. And yeah, I mean, if I could just sort of reiterate one point you made, it's that we put out a white paper actually last month at IETA just to sort of put a perspective out there and put a voice out there on behalf of members. And one of the main things that we really wanted to articulate was that there's a really core difference between a results-based payment and a carbon credit, and both of those things exist, and both of those things, you know, have their own sort of levels of integrity, and they just go through a different process, and they're two different things. I think is the main point. Certainly at this stage, right, of the market and the way that most people understand how those mechanisms work. So,
Why can't
yes.
we all just get along?
Exactly. It'd be very nice. But yeah, thanks for that question. Are there other questions in the room?
Thank you. Agnieszka from Carbon Markets at Equinor. I really like the discussion. I think it's painting a relatively positive world where, you know, there are obviously different approaches to jurisdictional credits, and, you know, each country kind of hopefully takes the approach that they should take. I do see a risk where it doesn't necessarily go that way, and some of the, we mentioned before, right? Some of the actors perhaps missing here are the governments. So the governments have their own, you know, mind about what kind of approach they want to follow. That might not necessarily go in those, you know, obvious ways, which might create a bit of confusion in the market and perhaps, you know, result in a bunch of credits which are not necessarily the highest quality, etc. Is there, I mean, do you see this as a potential concern, and is there anything that we can do as the, I guess, international community / private markets to somehow influence this?
Thanks for that question, and maybe sort of moderator privileges, if I can ask the panel to sort of simultaneously answer that question, but also sort of tie in some final thoughts and remarks around what you would like the future maybe of this market to look like and how jurisdictional approaches fit into that. But so hopefully each of you won't mind taking that question and providing some final thoughts.
Yeah, and it's something we didn't touch on during this panel, but I think one of the big concerns about pure jurisdictional approaches, which can be sort of top down, is do the benefits and the, you know, and you know, reach the communities. And I think there's, you know, so when we think about quality and integrity in these programs, you know, we have to think about, you know, sort of making sure that that is done well. And I think there's a lot of learnings that we can get from a lot of the programs that have been designed by the World Bank. I think that those approaches using their methodological frameworks and stakeholder engagement process are actually quite rigorous. So that's a lot of work that can kind of be brought over into the voluntary market as we think about kind of moving into this new world where we're, you know, selling, you know, jurisdictional credits into the voluntary market. So that would be my sort of main, not even concern, but just, you know, if, like in best possible scenarios, we are, that particular issue is done really, really well. And I will just say one more thing, is that, you know, I really think as we move into this new world that we cannot require that governments issue a corresponding adjustment when they issue credits into the voluntary market. I know that this is something that's being talked about, but there is kind of a justice issue here in that, you know, we need to get the financing to these governments, and if we require that they issue a corresponding adjustment or they can't sell credits before they meet their NDCs, that's just not achieving a just transition. Yeah.
Thanks, Sherry.
Okay.
Joe or Paul?
Shall I jump in?
Yep.
So I think my only answer really to addressing this political risk issue, since I don't know anything about insurance that we heard about earlier, is that to really ensure that the projects are permanent in the sense that they have meaning for the people who are actually implementing them for the long term, and that they actually embed into local practice and community communities at the ground level, is we need to commit as all the market actors, both the people who are paying for it and people who are implementing, to make sure that we absolutely focus on getting money to the people who are doing the work, to the local communities, the people who are bearing the costs of conservation. That is the insurance that we have put in place. And because of that, the government in Tanzania isn't even thinking about trying to take control of any of what's happening in Tanzania. They're seeing so much money going to the communities. If they cut that off today, they'd have millions of people on in their offices telling them, why have you stopped this industry? It's working for us. So that is the insurance we have to put in place. And what we mustn't allow is for actors and investors and people who want to get involved in projects to think that they can just go to some top-level government official or department and go, oh, we'll give you the money to do the project, and we'll just trust that everything will be fine, and we'll come back in a few years, or we'll measure every year and keep giving you money. Because that will just lead to exclusion of people from reserves, it will include enclosure, also all the things that we know will not lead to good nature conservation in the long term. So, my message is get the money into the hands of the people who are right there, living in and around these resources.
Thank you, Joe. And Paul, final thoughts?
Well, I think it's really exciting what's happening at the moment, and projects can think landscapes. Landscapes have to fit with projects. What I would encourage is not lots more regulation and detail. I think we've got plenty of good systems, and we need to keep working on them. But go back to some basic methodologies. We've been working with 50 different organisations, the World Bank and companies, conservation organisations, on a methodology for landscapes called the 4 Returns Framework for Landscape Restoration. I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. It's just a 5-step process to build landscapes. And if you're doing jurisdictional RED, or if you're doing peatlands, or if you're doing water catchments, it applies. It's just the project cycle. Get people together in a landscape, form a partnership, look at the problems and possible solutions, create a vision everyone's happy with and an action plan, get the money, make it happen, monitor and learn. It's not rocket science, but if you do it properly, you overcome a lot of the problems that are currently sitting that the carbon world is being criticised for, and you also start to think about these integrated solutions that are needed to solve the poly crisis. I think there's another step that we need beyond that as well, which is let's have a Manhattan project to bring together the people in the forestry world, the people in the agriculture world, the people in the peatlands world, people in the water world, the corporate supply shed landscape world. They're all talking the same thing, really. If we all agree on a common wiring diagram for this, and it doesn't have to be complicated, we can go back to our own complex systems in our own world and make sure that we've ticked all the boxes. And I think that would make our lives much simpler and allow us to talk to each other and invest in each other's programs. And I think the water world needs foresters. The agricultural world needs water specialists. The fisheries industry needs land-based management to make it work. So there is an interconnected world that we can design, and we're well on our way towards it. And I really thank the organisers of this conference for opening this conversation.
Thanks, Paul. A really nice way of connecting the dots. And thank you. And thanks very much to the panelists. I think we ended on a very practical but optimistic note. So thank you.
Thank you.